Hey, welcome to Managing Through Crisis, and I'm here with Dr. Gerard Lewis, the CEO of HELP Education Services and also Dean at HELP University. Dr. Gerard, tell us a bit about yourself. Maybe a quick introduction before we start this segment.
Yeah, thank you, Roshan. Pleasure to be here. I am a counseling psychologist by profession, actually. So before taking on all of these different responsibilities, one of my first passions early on in life was really in the area of counseling, and I've been involved in this field for over 20 years as a trained and professional counselor. Other than heading the largest psychology department in the country and managing 3 international schools, I'm really this is really an area of interest and passion for me, the area of counseling psychology.
Fabulous. And so you're exactly the right person to talk to. We are in a crisis now. How do we manage through this crisis? And I think one of the biggest things is managing fears and anxiety in the midst of this crisis, right? So I'm going to talk about that. I want to zoom in on managing fears and anxiety in this midst of crisis. So let us, let me just ask, what's the connection between our thoughts and emotion, specifically our feelings of fear and anxiety, that so many people are currently experiencing during this COVID-19 outbreak? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So let me just give a brief statement so that people understand why they feel, because a lot of the times our feelings have the power to just overwhelm us, and people don't understand where the feelings actually come from. And throughout our lives, even before COVID-19, as human beings, those emotions play a part of who we are as human beings. Yeah. So the first statement to just make is that our thoughts basically mediate between our emotions and our behaviors and then our physiology. So they're all interconnected. Yep. You cannot have emotions if something is not happening first. So the origins and starting point of how we feel really come from our thoughts. So let me give you some simple examples of the different kind of emotions. So for example, if you're happy, where does the happiness come from? If you look at all those experiences or feelings of happiness, it's simply because you perceive something in your life experience around you as adding to your life. So when you have a thought that, this is going to add to my life at this point in time, and of course I'm happy. Opposite of happiness is sadness. When you lose something of value to you, then automatically we feel sad. But the extent of that intensity of that sadness will really depend on the meaning we place to what is it that we have lost, whether we've lost a loved one, whether we've lost something of value to us. Yeah.
So
the same thing.
So I mean,
yes, of course. Right? Yeah. So coming to anxiety, for example, anxiety comes from a specific thought where you perceive a threat. You perceive a threat to your physical or psychological well-being, whether it's to you or to the people around you that are significant to you. So obviously, when you worry about something, when you look at, for example, if a student is preparing for an exam, it's just natural to get worried about this. I've got an exam coming. I don't know of any student who says, absolutely, everything's fine, and no worries, no fears. But if there are people like this, it's because they did the worrying way before the exam. They already have well prepared. But those last minutes, people who do last minute revision, of course, then the worry. But so the fear of, if I'm going to fail, I better do something about it. Yeah. And so the same thing for business people now is it's when they look at all the economic data that's coming out, and the country is going to be in recession, the world is going to be in a Great Depression again, not the likes of which we have not seen since 1930s. Then of course, so business people are worried. They're anxious about how to anticipate tomorrow. Yeah. And some bit of worry then pushes us every day. Those of us in leadership positions, we constantly are thinking of ways. So the anxiety, the worry, the stress helps a little bit, but as with all things, too much of a good thing is a bad thing, right? And that's what we want to talk about today. Yeah, what is it that is normal, and what is it that's not normal, and how do we manage that?
So basically, you're saying that anxiety is normal, and there's a healthy form of anxiety to some extent, but there's also this next level of unhealthy anxiety. How do we know that we are suffering from unhealthy anxiety, so to say? As you put it.
So think of people who have the experience of what we call a panic attack, and you come across this in our daily lives often, yeah. And it impacts all aspects of who we are. So behaviorally, we find that, there's a strong avoidance. Yeah, strong avoidance of a lot of things that we normally do on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes these people will just withdraw from the world. They don't want to interact with people because it's just too stressful. They don't want to see the news because it's just overly stressful. They don't want to interact. They suffer from, sleep disorders. They cannot sleep because constantly, even when you try to lie down, your mind is playing. You've just washed your hands, for example, and you spend the last 3 minutes, doing the hand washing ritual that we've been seeing on CNN and elsewhere. And immediately after washing, you come up and you touch something. It's just, oh my God, I don't know whether I cleaned that, and then you go back to washing. So, after a while, people develop what we call an obsessive compulsive disorder. And what is OCD? Basically, there's a thought that goes on, that obsession, the thought constantly, the place, and then the compulsion is what moves you to act on the thought. So that's why OC, right? Then it becomes a disorder. So when that's that constant worry from a behavior perspective, from a physical perspective, you suffer heart palpitations, and you don't know why. It just happens. Shortness of breath. You're feeling your hands start to sweat. Emotionally, you have a range of fears and restlessness, irritability. People wish you. Your wife wishes you in the morning during this MCO period and says, good morning, honey, and says, what's so good about this morning? We are still locked down, and you react in a way which you typically don't do under normal circumstances. And cognitively, you're constantly worrying about, what if, overly anticipating the future, because ultimately, when you think about anxiety, it's a future-paced event. It's something, it's not happening to you now, but you are anticipating that kind of worst-case scenario, and in your mind, somewhere in your mind, you say to yourself, I cannot cope. I don't have the resources, the strengths, the abilities to be able to cope with the what is going to happen in the future. It may not happen, but in your mind, it will. And therefore, all of these, feelings that eventually become a disorder.
Okay.
So, when you have
yeah. So just to summarize a bit, when we know it's unhealthy is when there's some behavioral change, there's some physicality or some changes physically, there's some emotional issues, in terms of our range of emotions and so on. And then you're talking about cognitively, that there's preoccupation with a specific, like, for example, the virus and so on.
And it's not that that normal people don't have them, they do, but it's the intensity, it's the duration of all of these symptoms put together that then creates, something what we call a mood disorder, an anxiety disorder. That becomes a disorder. This is not normal. The intensity of those emotions and the intensity and the length of which it actually happens.
Okay, yeah? So if we zoom into specifically this time, with the movement control and COVID-19 and, and the kind of anxiety, is that very different from a typical crisis, or is this something very different?
I think what is critically different of COVID-19 from all the other times is that every moment of every day, whenever you're on the news, and you can't run away, even if you don't turn on the TV, any news channel, it's 24 hours of the day giving you updates about the number of cases and the number of deaths, not the number of recoveries. Interestingly enough, that's often a fine print kind of thing. Yeah, but it's how many people more, because authorities obviously have to look at the increase in the new cases, to make a determination as to whether to continue or enforce some kind of a restriction to tighten the order of movement order, so it's the intensity of those situations.
Okay.
And even though with your WhatsApp, you can't run away. Even if you don't have the news on, people will keep sending you all sorts of things. And of course, you see, so every moment of every waking moment that you have, you are constantly reminded of your mortality. And people keep telling us, which is true. Don't get me wrong. I mean, all of those advisories are important, and we need to take them very, very seriously, because lives will be impacted and people will die. Some people will die. But when you think about it, we are faced with the same thought of death every day of our lives, even before this.
Yes.
Yeah, when you get out of the house, you don't know whether on our Malaysian roads whether you'll die from an accident, because they're more likely the high mortality rate. That's why we seek up every holiday period, every festival period to reduce, because we know for a fact that during Opsika people will die on the roads, because for some reason we have this fantastic tendency not to keep safe during speed limits. People like to speed, and so we don't think about our mortality, but it's there. You might be having a shower, you might be having a meal, and you suddenly collapse of a heart attack. So the idea of death and our mortality is always there. But what is different now is that we constantly are reminded of that mortality. And when you think about it, one of the greatest fears, if not the greatest fear in all of our lives, is coming coming face to face with that mortality. That ultimately is the greatest level of anxiety that we have. When you're given a diagnosis, a terminal diagnosis that you're suffering from cancer and there's no cure for the kind of cancer that you have, of course, immediately it impacts on you. So it's just the intensity, the constant reminder about that. That is what makes this period so different. Yeah.
And it really gets to you. So let's zoom in on how do we manage and cope, right? Because we know it's not going to go away. I mean, these reports, this news, the WhatsApp messages, the ridiculous number of groups that forward the same old stuff, and I mean, this intensity is not going to go away. How do we cope, manage through this crisis that we are facing now? What should we be doing?
I mean, how do we cope in everyday life when we know that at some point we will die? Not if we will die, but when we will die in normal circumstances.
Maybe let's do it, because there's different perspectives also. Maybe let's zoom in.
Yes.
Maybe we start with, like, say, a personal perspective, and then maybe a family perspective, and then a community perspective or business perspective.
That's right.
So maybe we start with the personal perspective first, right?
So from the personal perspective, how do we learn to come to terms with our mortality? By acknowledging that we will die at some point or another. We attend funerals. So once in a while we remember this and we reflect that, I better live my life a bit meaningfully, isn't it? I better do something before it happens to me. I make my life worthwhile. This famous psychologist called Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl talked about his experience as a survivor of the concentration camp during the Second World War, right? And then as a result of that, he ended up becoming quite a well-known psychologist. Wrote a book, Men's Search for Meaning, and developed an area of psychology called logotherapy, or the therapy of meaning. Okay, so think about just that for a minute, that even though for Frankl, just try and imagine a concentration camp kind of situation.
Yeah.
In the midst of 24 hours death, very similar to what we are facing, where you don't know, where life is cheap, where a prison guard can just shoot you because he doesn't like you, doesn't like your face, you didn't move fast enough. You've seen movies like this, Schindler's List, etc. Your fellow prisoners might just finger you for whatever reason, and you die. Every day you see trains. Every moment you see trains coming in and going on, and you see, you're covered in ash of the people who have been put to these gas chambers. Yeah. In moments like this, what keeps you alive? And Frankl had this very interesting insight. Yeah, and he said that in those long marches, when life seems so cheap and meaningless all around, he just stayed on with one thought. The thought that at the end of this, that there will be an end to this madness. And if he survived this, what will keep him going is the idea that he will one day be reunited with his loved ones, with his wife and with his children. Yeah. Now, he didn't know at that point that they were already dead, right? But it didn't matter whether they were alive or dead. It is just holding on to one central purpose in your life. I think one of these great philosophers, I forget whether it is Sartre or whether it's Nietzsche, who says, he who has a why can live with anyhow or whatever happens. So it's now starting from the most philosophical base, yeah? Just being mindful of why is it what gets you up in the morning every day during this lockdown period, during this restricted movement period. Your discovering. If you don't have one now, it's a good time to have. Starting with just that basic. This is what must get you out of bed every morning.
Yeah. So
right?
I mean, it's a good time to. It's a good time for us to articulate our why, right? Why we exist. And
that's right. Absolutely. Whether in your business, whether in your work, in your families, you need to be clear about the purpose of your life existence. Well, because ultimately we're all asking that question even before all of this. What is the purpose of my life existence? Why am I in this world? All of those are interesting existential questions, but we never paid very much attention to it. So starting with that. Then moving on with accepting the fact that, yes, this is a situation that I'm in, and then the Chinese would say, with every crisis, there's an opportunity. So discovering my why and relate my why, and relating it now with the opportunities rather than focusing on the crisis. I know the crisis is there. I accept this is a crisis. I don't like the fact that it's a crisis, but hey, you know, all great companies the world over will give you hundreds of stories about how they overcame the crisis, and we'll talk about it hopefully later when we talk about how business can overcome this. Yeah, and then you know, learning to do things as we would normally do in a regular situation, isn't it? When faced with our own mortality, we don't think about it, but we get on with life. Yeah, personally, we just get on with life. We don't stop. If you enjoy music, don't stop playing. You know, spending the first few minutes, first few mornings, sitting down in front of your piano or your keyboard or your saxophone or your whatever it is, your guitar, and doing the things that you would normally do in everyday life. Keeping as much as possible some kind of routine, some kind of normalcy in an abnormal kind of environment that we find ourselves in. So that's the first thing that we can do personally.
Okay. So that's personally, okay. So how about you know, in terms of your managing your family and coping with society in general, right? The community at large.
Yeah. I mean, often parents, when I give my parenting talks before this crisis, and then we talked about, you know, how 21st century living is, we have so little time to connect with our children, etc., etc. You know, and then we worry about who's taking care of them. So forth. Hey, I talked about crisis and opportunities. Now you have 24 hours of the day to be with your child, like it or not. Our parents realize what a tough job teachers actually have in school, when they not only have to manage their children, the children of parents who are sent to the school, and they have to do online learning, but they also have to manage their own families in the background. So now it's a fantastic time, isn't it, to really bond with your children, rediscover your spouse, appreciate the fact that, hey, you know, we have this time which we haven't really had much time together in the course of our everyday lives, because, you know, I get up, I leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning to the Klang Valley Jam, and I come back at 8 o'clock in the night, and by then you're already finishing your homework and getting ready for bed.
Yeah.
You know, now, okay, I get up in the morning before I start work, we're all together, let's have breakfast together, let's talk about, you know, how the day in school was, or online, you know, what's happening with your friends, how are you coping. And as a family, we need to realize, and as a community, we need to realize that we're all in this together.
Yeah.
And for better or for worse, what helps support us, what helps sustain us are the little messages of support, of encouragement that we can give, because all of us are going to deal with this situation in a very, very different way. I mean, just today alone, I've had about 4 or 5 requests from schools, from different companies, asking for help, because they recognize the mental and psychological toll that it's taking on their employees and their workers, and we are all very, very concerned about that. So
I mean, zooming into that final piece, I mean, business, right? I mean, there's so much fear. Not just fear of employees losing jobs, right? I mean, also as an owner of an organization, right? You know, when I look at the numbers, when I look at our revenue decline, I'm also conscious that we may lose the company potentially, right? And I'm sure there's many SME owners and even middle-sized companies. I wouldn't just say SMEs, right? There's a real fear of the company shutting down, right? And you know, both the employees, but also the business owners and the entrepreneurs and the startups. I mean, all this is real, right? For those of us in business, how I mean, what should we be thinking about, and what advice would you impart to us? You know,
I just recently had an interesting conversation with a very dear friend of mine who's doing his PhD in an area called narrative psychology. Right, I have to say this disclaimer: this is not an area of expertise for me. But that conversation was able to help me connect quite a few things. Now, this friend of mine is, has been a storyteller all his life. He's been in the performing arts. I've worked with him on coming up with a musical some years ago when we were all very much younger. And he's a storyteller par excellence. Yeah, he's worked in New York. He's worked in different platforms and areas in the performing arts. Yeah, and this friend of mine, name is Raymond, so I have to give credit to him. And his PhD is really on how do we work through a crisis period. Because when you think about it, everything that we do in our lives is very much connected to the stories that we have, whether it's related to our lives personally or to the companies that we have built, right?
Yeah.
And the starting point of telling a new story, so that what COVID-19 has done is help us accept the reality and become and acknowledge the fact that the future will not be the same. So our story has to change, right? So whatever businesses that we are in, whether now for us in education, and that's something that we talk about every day, what is it that we have to do differently? But an interesting part about storytelling is that your stories will not change until your rituals change, right? Okay. So for stories to change, what has to first change more than anything else is we have to change our rituals. What that means in business terms, we have to just change the way we've been doing things. And that's true, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. Until rituals change, until we change the way we interact with one another, until we start changing how we think about business models, then you will still come to the same point at the end of your story. Yeah, which is that I'm going to fail. Okay. Yeah. So to start with a new story, what Raymond was suggesting is that we look at the opposite of the worst case scenario. So like yourselves, worst case scenario for us, not just revenues dropping, that for many companies that we will go bankrupt and the company will fall. Yeah. So the opposite of that obviously is we want to succeed. Yeah. We don't want to fall, don't want to collapse. Okay. That's the starting end point. Okay. Now, what is it that then we need to start with in terms of a new storyline that we have? So think about all stories that we watch in the movies. All stories, whether it's a love story or whether it's an adventure story, etc. They already know what the end point. Before you write the story, you already know what your end point is. So people like the great gurus like Stephen Covey will talk about this in management terms, are beginning with the end in mind. Right. So all of those truths are now coming back, but put in different ways. Yeah. So narrative psychology talks about starting your new storyline with what is it that you want to see happen now in this new story. Right. But you know that in all stories, whether it's a love story, as I said, that this boy interested in this girl, especially in nice Bollywood movies, he will go through all sorts of obstacles along the way. It's not a boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, they end up happily ever after. Boy meets girl, there will be barriers from the parents, there will be barriers from the community, the personal challenges that he has to go through because different castes, different social economic status, etc. So along the way, barriers will be thrown at him, right? And that's how it is. New storyline. At the end goal is I want this girl that I'm going to marry at all costs, right? And he has to find a way. Our hero has to find a way to overcome this. And what keeps us engrossed in the storyline is his ability to overcome the obstacles that are thrown at him.
Yes.
So now in the new business environment, accept, acknowledge those obstacles. Okay. But it's not that life is difficult. There's another great writer, Scott Peck, in his book, Life is Difficult, The Road Less Traveled. It's not that life is difficult. We all have to acknowledge that life is difficult. And Peck says, unless and until we acknowledge this, we won't be able to say 10, 20 years from now, when we look back and when we've had this problem-solving mindset, which is what 21st century skills is all about, we won't be able to say when we look back, actually life has not been so difficult. But because we acknowledge it from the start, that life is difficult. And because of that, we learn to work through the difficulties of life. So that 10 years, 20 years down the road, and we say, look back, it's actually not so bad. Because we've survived. We've gone into life with always expecting that life will throw challenges at us. So that's how it is with the hero of any story, isn't it? He expects. But what we also know along the way is that in the narrative, there will be certain things that will happen to us, to the hero. So every time now when I watch a movie, I'm listening to what my friend tells me about storytelling, and you will find that there will be something that will happen, and all of these great success stories in our great companies will tell you something pivotal that happened, where it was something, someone, where it's, they say whether it's coincidence, serendipity, it's something that will happen that will help you further along your life, along the storyline.
Yeah.
Because if your hero dies middle of the story, nobody enjoys that story, and nobody will watch the movie, right? So think of it that for people of faith, therefore, and all of us who are in business at some point or another in our life, sometimes you just have to develop some deep spiritual core, that if you acknowledge that your life in this world has got a greater purpose beyond yourself, then sometimes when you what helps people at the personal level is spirituality. Getting inside yourself, and when things seem hopeless, still never giving up hope, as someone would always remind me, where there's life, there's hope. And even if you've gone bankrupt, how many people have come back to us to tell us, even at the point of bankruptcy, I've come back, I've rebounded. Where there's life, there's hope. And never give in to the feelings, that overwhelming feelings of hopelessness that you face at this point in your company's journey. Even if you're the CEO, never giving in to that, because many people will, because they don't have enough resources in them. And naturally, human beings, if it is just too overwhelming, people do give up. That's why this is such a dangerous period for us personally and business-wise, because look at the German finance minister. I mean, for him to have taken his life must have been so overwhelming that he just couldn't live with the thought of what the future was meant to hold for him. And we hope that it doesn't happen to any more people, right? That because we're all in this together, don't give up. Find something deep within ourselves during our journey, during the obstacles that we will encounter, and it will be, and the end is the happily ever after end that we all anticipate, that we all hope will happen. So it's not some kind of pipe dream, some kind of fairy tale, right? But it's because at every moment of every day, and that's the crux to dealing with anxiety. A critical point of dealing with anxiety is what they call mindfulness. Anxiety, as I mentioned earlier is about the future, is future-based, right? But in your process of working through your stories, you are focusing on the moment, on the present, because this is the only reality that you have. And when you can focus on the moment and being mindful of what you are doing, then you don't think about the anxiety anymore. You're focusing on the now. That's why all of those things, when we listen to a lot of these things all over throughout our lives, but these are the little dots now that we have to learn to connect. Those are the truths of human existence that will, I think, help us get through this in time to come.
So, I mean, just to summarize, I think I learned a lot. I mean, I really like the point about finding ourselves. I mean, in this crisis, it's a great opportunity for us to know who we are. And for those who haven't figured it out, it's a time for us to do some good deep-seated reflection, take some time to truly understand why we're here, what's our purpose, what's our legacy, what really is the core of who we are and what we're here for. I think the other piece is that connect with the relationships that are around us, whether it's family or whether it's the community and so on, and treasure it, because time is precious, and whether it's now or another crisis or somewhere else, we really have no control over time. The other piece that I learned, I really like, is this whole thing about narrative psychology, where we are ultimately the stories that we make up for ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
And how do we edit these stories, I mean, to paraphrase a little bit, because story editing is a process of, we do that with videos, we edit it and so on, but here's an opportunity. I guess this crisis presents an opportunity for us to look at our story and say, look, we want the end to be something else, because when we look at it today, because that's what causes us anxiety, when we think the ending is going to be a bad ending, but edit the ending and say, no, let's find a different ending. And then now let's navigate through the obstacles to figure out how to do this new ending. So I really enjoyed this conversation, Dr. Gerald. I mean, it's hopefully it's not just helpful for me, but for many others out there. It is a tough I think for businesses, for individuals, for teachers, for everyone, right? It's a new world that we are navigating in. So maybe in the last 30 seconds, one final piece of advice, in terms of navigating this fear and anxiety in this crisis.
In navigating your news stories, one thing we will realize is, I talked about failure. I talked about the obstacles and expect failure. I was watching a recent Netflix series called The Travelers, and there was one particular episode where the director, this AI from the future, kept sending these travelers back into the past, right? And he kept sending different kinds of travelers into this host body because they had to save the mission. The whole point was saving the mission. So Groundhog Day. So the episode kept coming back to the same point, but different travelers trying different things, and about 7 or 8 reboots, right? 7 or 8 reboots every time they failed, but the mission had to succeed. But what happened each time and after each reboot was that there was an alternative way. They kept exploring alternative ways despite the host eventually dying, until finally the 8th or 9th reboot, they succeeded. And haven't we heard this in our management guru conversations, isn't it? Try and try again until you succeed.
And with that, I'm going to end with, because I think end games, when you watch Avengers, right, when Doctor Strange starts to calculate, there's there's only one option for us to succeed, and it's going to be this, and whatever it is, there's always going to be that one way, right? And I think find that one way and figure it out how to do that. Thanks a lot, Dr. Gerard.
Absolutely.
From HELP University.
Thank you, Roshan.
Thank you. Appreciate this conversation. We look forward to many more in this Managing in Crisis series. Thanks a lot. Wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Roshan. Take care of yourself also. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.